Previously I installed the entities package for Unity and I created a basic subscene for a player character. This subscene allows me to turn the character into an entity. Currently this is a very basic player with a capsule and a box. I'll now be working on input, and to do this I'm going to create another entity. I'll also need to do some organization in terms of storing these. I'll start by adding a folder under my game folder, and this folder will be called prefabs. We can add a new folder under the prefabs folder. This folder will be called controllers. For the player, I'm going to have two controllers associated with the player, which are not explicitly going to be part of the player entity. These are going to be a controller for controlling the camera, as well as a controller for controlling the player input. Both of these will be created by adding an empty game object to the scene, and I'll move both of these game objects into my player subscene. I'll call the first of these controller input. The second will be called controller camera. I'll move both of these game objects into the controllers folder to convert them into prefabs. So that will give us our setup. Next we can start working on the script. I'm going to add these under our player folder. This will be an authoring script, and this will be auth input. I'll add this script to our input controller. I'll need to open the prefab for this, and I'll add it to the game object. I'll return to the main scene, and I can open the script. By default, the script will have a mono behavior. I can remove the methods from this. This mono behavior will be used for our interface within Unity, so I will not delete it. This will need a baker in order to convert it to an entity. This will be done with a class, so this will be public class. I will call this class bake input. This will inherit from baker, and I'm going to be baking the auth input mono behavior. We'll need to add the overrides here. We can add all the overrides, but in this case we only really need the bake override for the baker class. We can now add the components we'll need for this entity. These components will all apply specifically to this entity and not to other entities, so I'll include them all within the script. These will be public structs. I'll call the first one xButton, and we'll define this as a component using the iComponentData interface. This will have one member, and it will be a public bool, and it will be called value. This will be the first of our buttons, and most of them will be similar to this, so I'll duplicate this line a few times. The X button will be followed by the Y button, as well as an A button and a B button. All of the buttons will have the same functionality, so they'll all be public bools with the name value. After these buttons, we'll have a component which will be called left stick. This will be followed by a left trigger, which will be followed by my right stick and my right trigger. Then I'll have my D-pad, my select button. I've run out of buttons, so I'll duplicate this, and the duplicate will be for my start button. Not all of these controls will have Boolean outputs, so these will need to be updated where appropriate. The D-pad will have a two-dimensional output, so this value will be a float 2. The left stick will also have a float 2 value, as will the right stick. I can now add these components to my entity. In the baker class, we'll work with the bake function. I'll create an instance of an entity here, and this will be called input entity. I will set this with getEntity, and the argument here will be transformFlags.none. I can use var to specify the type of the entity. I'm not really a fan of the var type, as I prefer to be more explicit. The getEntity function will return an entity, so instead of setting this as a var, I'll set it as an entity. I can now add my components to the entity. I'll use the addComponent method. The first argument will be my input entity. The second argument will be the component. In this case, it will be xButton. I'll need to declare this with new, and this will take no arguments. I'll duplicate this line a number of times, as we'll need to have all of our buttons added. After the X button, we will have the Y button, then the A button, and the B button. This will be followed by my left stick, and my left trigger, Then we'll have the right stick and the right trigger. After this, we'll have the D-pad. I'll then have my select and my start buttons. Here I should note a couple of errors. The triggers are not Boolean values, so I'll need to fix that later. I also have not yet added the shoulder buttons, and this I'll also need to fix later. I can add another component which I'll add before I add any of the buttons, and this component is going to be called tag input. I'll add the component itself before the buttons. This will be a public struct. The name is tag input. It will inherit from the iComponent data interface. This will be an empty struct, and it is only used to identify this specific entity. This will give us the initial interface for the controller. I'll return to Unity and I'll update my scene. I'll then press play, and I can examine my entity. I can select my controller input, and in the inspector we should now see all of the components that we have just added. All of these values are going to be used to store and reference our input controls. This is probably not the best way to do this, but I'm doing it this way because it's easy. This will also allow me to debug all my inputs in a single place. I can worry about more robust systems later. So this input will not work by itself. I'll need to create a system which will read the actual inputs from the controller itself and will pass the values of the inputs into this entity. I'll need a script for the system, and I'll add this in my player folder. I'll call this sys player input. For the moment I'm going to specify my inputs separately, as I may want to separate certain types of input from the player. I can then open the script. I will work with this as a class, and I'll inherit from system base. That means that this will interact with mono behaviors and is not for a pure entity. We'll need to import a library in order to work with the input system. We will get this with using Unity engine.inputSystem. I'll remove the boilerplate from the class. I will need to implement an onUpdate method. Here I'll want to get a reference to an entity. I'll call this entity input. We're going to get this entity using a utility library from Unity. This utility library is under System API. Here I'll call the getSingletonEntity method. This will allow us to retrieve an entity which only has a single instance. So for example, we will only ever have one player or one player input. If I was going to work on co-op, I'd need to change this as we would have more than one player, and therefore we'd also have more than one controller. But currently I'm only working on a single player setup. In this case, the single entity that I'm going to look for is my input entity, and I'll get this by looking for my tag which I created earlier, which is tag input. I'll need to fix the errors with my class. This should actually be a public partial class. I can now start creating references for my buttons. I'll start with var X button. I'll want an instance of my X button, so this will be new X button. I'll then set the value of this with gamepad.current. We'll then want the X button. There are a large number of options which I can use here, but for the moment I'm going to use isPressed. So this will give us the value from the X button itself. I can now use this to set our component on our entity. I'll use the setComponent method for this. The first argument will be our entity, which is the input entity. The second argument is going to be the value which we're going to set, and this will be our X button. The setComponent method is not actually part of the system-based class. We should actually call it from System API, so this should actually be systemapi.setComponent. This will give us the first of our buttons. I'll duplicate this because we'll need to do this for all of our input. After the X button, we'll have the Y button, then the A button, and the B button. After this, we'll have left stick. I haven't actually updated the button input itself yet. These should be Y button.isPressed, A button.isPressed, B button. Then we'll have our left stick. The left stick is an analog input and is not a button. So instead of press button, we'll have read value here. I have an issue for my next value. The next value is for the left trigger. This value should not be a Boolean, it should be a float. So I'll need to update my authoring component. The left trigger should now contain a public float value. I have also not added in my shoulder button. I'll copy my B button. This component will be called left shoulder. I will also need another button, which is the button on the stick itself. I'll call this button left button. Both of these buttons will be Boolean values. These buttons will need to be repeated for the right side. So we'll have the right shoulder, and I'll have the right button. These components will also need to be added to my entities. To do this, I'll make some duplicates of my left trigger, as well as my right trigger components. I can then add the left shoulder and the left button, as well as the right shoulder and the right button. I can return to my system and I'll add the left shoulder now. This will be set by gamepad.current.leftShoulder.isPressed. Next we'll have the left trigger. I'll need to fix my copy and paste errors. The value for the left trigger will be set with gamepad.current.leftTrigger.readValue. The trigger will be followed by my left button. The value here will be set with gamepad.current.leftButton.leftStickButton.isPressed. I'm getting an error here, so I'm going to check my authoring. There is a mistake which is not currently relevant, but I will fix it, and that is the right trigger should be a float value and not a Boolean. The problem here is that isPressed is actually a property and not a method, so I should remove the parentheses. I will need to correct this for all of my buttons. However, for my stick and my trigger, the read value is a method. I'll duplicate the variables for my left sticks, and I will rename all of these for the right side. After these, I'll have my D-pad. The D-pad will read a value. After this, I'll have my select button. And finally, we'll have the start button. This should give me input values for all of my buttons, and I'll now want to apply these values to my entity. I've already done this with one of the components, in this case the X button. I'll repeat this for the rest of the values, so I can duplicate this line. So after our X button, we'll have our Y button, then our A button, then our B button, the left stick, the left shoulder, and the left trigger, followed by the left button. We'll then have the right stick, the right shoulder, the right trigger, and the right button. This will be followed by our D-pad, our select button, and our start button. This will complete our input. I can save and I can return to Unity. After the asset manager is updated, I can play. And we'll want to examine the inspector and make sure that our button inputs are being read here. I'll go through all of the buttons. We want the checkbox to appear whenever we press a button. So for example, here I have my X button and my Y button. The D-pad should give me values of 1 or -1, and this should give me values for both the X-axis and the Y-axis. I should get float values for my left stick and right stick, as well as for my triggers. My shoulder buttons are working as well. So I'm now storing my game input within the scene, and any part of the scene which I need to access the input can get it from this entity. And we're going to use this next when we examine the next part of the scene which we need for a basic setup, and that is our camera.